When we talk about strategy to stop the largest government in history using a combination of noncompliance and other forms of resistance on a state, local, and individual level, some people seem to take the position that we're just talking about things in theory. We're just philosophizing, but we're actually taking what the founders and old revolutionaries not only told us to do, but did in practice, and they did it effectively, and we're just doing what they said because it works. And on Friday's show, I went through a number of examples highlighting heavily the Whiskey Rebellion in 1791 through 94, some examples of how they used this strategy successfully in the early days of the Republic, highlighting in the Whiskey Rebellion how the historians have it completely backwards on what really went down. And today, I've got a follow-up episode to show how this strategy that was used in the early days of the Republic against the general government, the federal government, was almost the same approach used during the entire American Revolution. That is, the revolution, the radical change of the views of the people from 1760-ish through the shot heard round the world in 1775. And I want to start out here with a little bit from the penman of the Revolution, John Dickinson, because his work was so widely known and so widely read, especially his letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania in 1767, that he was called the penman of the Revolution. So he was the most widely read guy on American liberty up until Thomas Paine's Common Sense in 1776. So this was very influential in strategy and philosophy and approach. And when when it came to how a free people should respond to government usurpation, so usurpation is a theft of power from the sovereign people of the several states today. The people are the source of all power. So whatever the setup is, when government goes beyond its limits, it's stealing, and it shouldn't be doing that. But what do you do about it? Do you go to the government and just try to convince the government to stop doing what the government wasn't supposed to do in the first place? Well, for a very moderate guy like Dickinson, certainly that was the first step, but you don't stop at the first step if the first step doesn't work, because government isn't sovereign. Government doesn't have final say over the people. So he said, citizens, this is not a quote, but citizens, this is from an article by Rob Nailson, The Message of the Farmer Letters, citizens should oppose small usurpations immediately to prevent them from acquiring the force of precedent. For people like Dickinson and so many others of the old revolutionaries, precedent was the great problem, and Thomas Jefferson talked about this years later in his opposition to the so-called constitutionality of the National Bank in 1791, saying that if you take a single step beyond the limits of the Constitution, you allow them to do that, then the rules don't matter. You've basically given them a boundless field of power, is how Jefferson put it. So Dickinson also took this position. In one of his letters in the Farmer Letters, he specifically was pointing out how some people were saying this is not as bad as the Stamp Act, so we shouldn't get too worked up about it. And he's like, no, it's the other way around. And I'm paraphrasing this. Of course, he would be much more eloquent than I. But he's basically saying even the smallest thing is the greatest worry, because that's the one that doesn't bring up all the alarm that the large steps. And each of those small steps establishes a precedent that builds and builds and builds. And then all of a sudden you're like, well, wow, now we're underwater. This thing is really nasty. Things are really bad. And you can see how government doesn't go from, well, what's supposed to be limited to the largest in history in one fell swoop. But he said in a number of letters, so in letters 11 and 12, one, for example, a perpetual jealousy. Now, this is not like a relationship jealousy, but talking about paying attention, like, oh, okay, we're on guard for people who might attack liberty. A perpetual jealousy regarding liberty is absolutely required in all free states. Perpetual, constant, no matter what. Even if you get the people in there that you like, you still have to constantly be on guard, because human nature and the nature of power, the maxims of all through history, show that, well, corrupt people go to positions of power, and then power always expands. Even when good guys are in there, they try to use it for good things, but they don't live forever, and they don't stay in power forever, and eventually the bad guys get in power. And so you never want to actually advocate for more government power, really, which they did not follow all of their own recommendations, but that's human nature. So perpetual jealousy regarding liberty is absolutely required in all free states. And in letter 12, he said, let us take care of our rights, and we therein take care of our prosperity. Slavery is ever preceded by sleep. So if okay, everything's cool now that we got this guy in charge, that's when things get really, really bad. Now, back to Rob Natelson. He said, however, opposition should proceed cautiously. Now, John Adams, the hothead, the Atlas of Independence, he wanted to push a little bit more aggressively. Well, not at first either, but Dickinson thought there was a process that should be followed. Letter 3 contended that citizens must first petition for a redress of grievances. Only if petitioning was unsuccessful should citizens proceed to peaceful civil disobedience. And only if both those steps failed should they employ force. And I would say that the entire revolution really followed this process. And I want to show some examples. This is not going to be comprehensive. I don't have all day today. But some examples of how this went down using this process, starting out with say, hey, this is unconstitutional. You need to stop. When they don't stop, you follow up with noncompliance and other forms of kind of throwing a monkey wrench into things. And then from there only do you employ physical force. That was like the last thing that should be done. In fact, they really, really waited until they came to confiscate guns before there was a fighting back. And again, this was a defensive response in 1775. And here from a new article that we published this morning I think we ran it last night, by Mike Meharry. He pointed out that the revolution, this is a revolution in thought, not the war for independence. The revolution preceded the war for independence. It grew with a combination of rhetoric and resistance. As the British asserted more and more unconstitutional authority over the colonies, and I know there's always someone out there who says, well, there was no constitution yet, but the British system was an unwritten constitution, and the founding generation, the old revolutionaries, often referred to stuff that government wasn't supposed to do as unconstitutional. That's part of why they wanted a written constitution, so it was supposed to be clear on paper. Another story. So as the British asserted more and more unconstitutional authority over the colonies, Americans responded by formulating well-developed arguments and action plans against British actions. This revolution in thought drove colonial rhetoric that started with opposition to the writs of assistance in 1761 and intensified to resistance with the passage of the Stamp Act in 1765. So following Dickinson's approach before Dickinson put it on paper really was, hey, first point out you're not supposed to do this. When they don't back down, then ramp it up. And when they don't back down, ramp it up. And government always ramps it up and tries to make things worse. Well, not always. But when they think they can get away with it, or they have so much hubris, and some of these people certainly do have so much arrogance, they think they can do anything to the people, and the people are just going to bend a knee because, well, they have been for a long, long time. But here, starting out 1761, James Otis Jr. in his great, I think it was like 4-hour speech against the writs of assistance, February 24, 1761, he pointed out that an act against the Constitution is void. He was using words to say you shouldn't be doing this. He lost that case, and we recognize that they don't get void in practice just by saying so. And during the ratification debates, Roger Sherman really pointed out this same kind of thing. He said, though the general government, this is December of 1787, though the general government in matters within its jurisdiction is paramount to the constitutions and laws of the particular states, yet all acts of the Congress not warranted by the Constitution would be void. So 1761, James Otis Jr., the beginning of the controversy between the colonies and Great Britain, his argument against the writs of assistance points out that when they do stuff that they're not authorized to do, it's void. Well, what do you do with something that's void? You just sit around and wait for them to stop? Maybe you make the case that they're not authorized to, and when they don't listen, you got something to back that up. And Sherman said, nor could they be enforced contrary to the sense of a majority of the states. And what some people might seem to miss about this is that not being able to enforce means that, first of all, someone is trying to enforce, and the only reason they're trying to enforce it is because the people and the states are not complying. You can't have an enforcement conflict or an inability to enforce something if everyone just complies and goes along with it. So implied here, which should be very obvious, is Sherman saying that to enforce the Constitution, when they usurp power, their acts are void and the people and the states have to refuse to comply with it. This is the exact same thing that James Madison said that I highlight far more often. I should highlight Sherman a little bit too, in Federalist number 46. And I pointed out how on Friday's show, how when Madison was in office and he was doing stuff that the people did not like, that they were following his advice and refusing to cooperate, refusing to participate. They weren't giving up militia for Mr. Madison's war in the War of 1812. And a newspaper even republished his whole Federalist number 46 argument explaining this is how you deal with stuff, whether you think it's unconstitutional or you just disagree with the policy. And Madison was very specific. He said the disquietude of the people, their repugnance, and perhaps refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. That's exactly what he said should be done in response to trying to stop federal programs. But back to the Revolution, because that's really what we're getting to here. But I want to kind of tie it all together with Sherman and Madison and pointing out how this has a very long lineage, we'll call it there. And they were both certainly channeling, I think, Patrick Henry's response to the Stamp Act. Because as Meharry pointed out in that article I cited just a minute or two ago, they started out with this rhetoric. They started out with the petition, just like Dickinson said. Start out by saying, hey, this is unconstitutional. You're not authorized to do it. And when they don't back down, you have to ramp it up. Because if you continue to allow the precedent to take hold, it's never, ever going to end. And when John Adams was one of the good guys, he pointed out that encroachment upon the Constitution is like a cancer. It grows faster and faster every hour. It gets worse and worse and worse. So here's Patrick Henry in response to the Stamp Act, starting to put that next step into practice, saying, well, you got to stop complying with their stuff, because if they try to enforce things, they try to pass stuff and no one goes along with it, they may get a little bit more aggressive. And we certainly see that the British did that, and I'm sure the American Empire would do the same. But this is how you get it done, and it takes some backbone, some fortitude and perseverance, as Samuel Adams put it. So Patrick Henry just gets into office. He's a young dude. It's just like his birthday. I think it was his birthday or the day after. He introduced these resolutions against the Stamp Act, pointing out that you don't have to even comply with it. He's actually putting this into practice, that the inhabitants of this colony are not bound to yield obedience to any law or ordinance whatever designed to impose any taxation whatsoever upon them other than the laws or ordinances of the General Assembly aforesaid. So the mentality of Patrick Henry in this passed, it ended up getting, I think they flipped the vote after he got it passed. He was young and just kind of left the stage for a little bit, and then they repealed it. But this ended up getting republished everywhere. And so this really lit a fire under the resistance up in Boston and elsewhere in response to the Stamp Act. And he's saying, look, any taxation that the far-off government tries to do, this is kind of an original 10th Amendment type of an argument. They only get to do certain stuff. There's a line in the sand. And if they go beyond it, no one is bound to yield obedience. So he's encouraging disobedience. And we know that the disobedience to the Stamp Act really ramped up in Boston and elsewhere. Here's Dickinson again, his great broadside against the Stamp Act later in 1765. Pointing out that if you comply with the act by using stamped papers, you rivet perpetual chains upon your unhappy country. You unnecessarily, voluntarily establish the detestable precedent which those who have forged your fetters ardently wish for, to varnish the future exercise of this new claimed authority. So again, if you comply with the act, you establish the detestable precedent. And he's even taking the position it doesn't even matter how small it is, because that's how he warned about this a couple years later against the Townshend Acts in 1767. No matter how small those steps are, they always want to use it as a stepping stone for more. Government people don't say, oh, well, we got away with this little one. Let's just stop here. We're good. We don't want to make things better for us and worse for everybody else. They certainly, really, their arrogance thinks that they're always going to keep pushing. But if the people allow it to happen, then we know who's really at fault. But that's, again, another discussion. Dickinson, again, continued, same broadside against the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act, therefore, is to be regarded only as an experiment of your disposition. If you quietly bend your necks to that yoke, you prove yourselves ready to receive any bondage to which your lords and masters shall please to subject you. So again, it gets down to compliance. It gets down to precedent. It gets down to the willingness and the backbone of the people to take a stand for their liberty, whether government likes it or not. Now, he wasn't saying, start a shooting war. He's saying just don't comply. This is the stage that it has to be. Well, then we see what happens. Don't comply and do it in large numbers. And they certainly did that. They certainly ramped it up a little bit beyond that as well. And we know in response to the Stamp Act, there was a combination of protests and resolutions and making the case that they should repeal. There were declarations. There was disobedience. There was support from merchants opting out, non-enforcement by sheriffs and other local officials. And this all created a climate where the Stamp Act was totally unenforceable. So it worked against the largest empire in history. Parliament, this is from an overview, an episode that I did on this a few years ago, the People's Nullification of the Stamp Act, highlighting a lot of Murray Rothbard's great work on this. Parliament ended up repealing it even though they didn't want to. And this is what Rothbard called the People's Nullification of the Stamp Act. But this certainly wasn't the end of the story. And this type of thing kept playing out through the Revolution. Again, the Revolution happened before the war commenced. This was the radical change in the viewpoints of the people. We have to consider something that is almost never talked about, really, the Quartering Act, or at least the first one in 1765. That came out around the same time. It was given royal assent on May 15th of that year and provided that Great Britain would house its soldiers in American barracks and public houses. I'm not going to get into details on that. But really, the end result is what's most important. The back and forth, the resistance, the ramp up by government, the resistance, the ramp up by government just keeps going through this process. When 1,500 British troops, and this is from Wiki, arrived at New York City in 1766, the New York Provincial Assembly refused to comply with the Quartering Act and did not supply billeting for the troops. The troops had to remain on their ships. This is a huge embarrassment to the empire. They're just saying, this local assembly say we're not going to do what you tell us to do. And mind you, it wasn't just New York. It was circumvented basically in all of the colonies except Pennsylvania, where Dickinson is from, surprisingly, but they were just not participating to various degrees in the enforcement of that. And here from Mike Meharry then, so their follow-up to that, the British then, of course, government always tries to ramp it up. They follow up in 1767. They followed up passing 4 laws together known as the Townshend Acts. These laws impose new taxes on the importation of paper, paint, lead, glass, and tea, and expanded the British government's power to fight smuggling. They did not like people having a more free market. They liked the regulated market, just like today. They also included something called the New York Restraining Act. And the New York Restraining Act, and I think they were trying to single out New York, because they were trying to make an example of New York for refusing to comply with the Quartering Act. And I think the Quartering Act of 1765 had actually even been repealed shortly after that or around that time, but they still didn't like the idea of the colonies getting uppity. And we see this happen today. The central government, the former federal government in Washington, D.C., they like to basically take action against states who get out of line. They're always threatening them with something. And this is the way that government works. So they punished New York by basically saying, well, we're not going to allow you to go into session anymore. And this, of course, led to more resistance by the people. And Meharry puts it this way: as with the Stamp Act, published protests led to more concrete actions. And I'm jumping through this just very briefly. But in March of 1768, a committee of Boston merchants drafted a series of resolutions establishing an agreement to stop buying most goods imported from England. They're like, okay, well, if you're going to keep trying to boss us around, we're going to hit you in the wallet where we know that's the most impact on you people. And finally, Mike writes, on August 1st of 1768, approximately 60 Boston merchants and traders signed an agreement based on resolutions. On those resolutions, only 16 refused to do so. I mean, that was a pretty significant amount, but this was really the beginning of this process of saying, well, we're just not going to participate in a bigger and bigger way. Then we also have down in Virginia, the Virginia Association. George Washington suggested a broad non-importation agreement in response to the Townshend Acts. He suggested it to George Mason, who worked with Richard Henry Lee, and they drafted one up. And here's, for example, a little bit from this as well. They will not at any time hereafter directly or indirectly import or cause to be imported any manner of goods, merchandise, or manufacturers which are or shall hereafter be taxed by act of Parliament for the purpose of raising a revenue in America. So they're just saying, if you're going to try to tax us, we won't do that business anymore because you don't deserve to get that money. It's illegal for you to do it, and we're going to starve the beast until we can get back to normal. He said they will always consider such taxation in every respect as an absolute prohibition, and in all future orders direct their correspondence to ship them no goods whatever. Taxes, as aforesaid, except as is above accepted. They kept a couple of exceptions in that, but it's really starting to move forward, and that's pretty aggressive for George Washington, I think, at the time. And Meharry points out that this did have some impact. It wasn't as effective as what they wanted it to be, but he said that overall, exports from Great Britain to the American colonies declined by about 38% just over the year in 1769. So once Virginia and up in Boston and elsewhere, they were doing this as well. And I'm just giving you some highlights. They reduced the imports by 40%. And everyone knew that they were having to basically give stuff up. This was not necessarily easy for everybody. And a lot of people did try to circumvent it. But still, they recognized that this is the way that they had to fight back. And Mike says, while not as significant as Patriot leaders might have hoped, the boycott and protests got the attention of British officials. And so by early 1770, Lord North, the new prime minister, proposed a partial repeal of the Townshend taxes. It's not like they were going to just repeal out of the goodness of their heart. They never do that. They're not going to get rid of something that they want to do. They're taxing them for war expenses. They're for stationing a large permanent standing army there as early as 1763 and saying, well, you owe it to us because we're saving you. And that's how they owe it. For your security is generally really means how we can control you because we really want to control you. So they don't really get rid of stuff unless people make it so difficult to collect or to implement that they have to kind of save face. Mike writes, some members of Parliament advocated for a complete repeal, but the Lord argued they needed to keep the duty on tea in place to assert the right of taxing the Americans. And that's basically what Dickinson was getting at. Even if you think this is just a small thing, once you give them the right to do this by your compliance, it'll never, ever end. And we know a few years after Dickinson wrote this stuff, Lord North is specifically saying, well, we got to keep this so we can really affirm this right of implementing these taxes. Now, a lot of people were like, okay, we got a big W here. Everything's cool. And Samuel Adams really urged people to remain vigilant at this time because, like Dickinson said, a perpetual jealousy regarding liberty is absolutely required if you're going to have any level of freedom. And here's Samuel Adams in October of 1771 pointing out that what they should do. Instead of sitting down satisfied with the efforts we have already made, which is the wish of our enemies, the necessity of the times more than ever calls for our utmost circumspection, deliberation, fortitude, and perseverance. So in other words, even when you get a W against the empire, and we do get them, certainly, we have that published in our State of the Nullification Movement report. We'll have the 2023 edition available online at 10thamendmentcenter.com/report very soon. I've just been a little behind schedule on trying to get things updated on the website, but we do have the text ready to roll. And we have printed copies. We're working on the ebook version as well behind the scenes. So that should be available for you guys for free very, very soon. But we report on wins. But just because you get a win or a step forward for liberty in the Constitution in any area, you should never, ever give up because we still live under the largest government in history. We are not in the land of the free, and there's so much more that has to be done. And Samuel Adams was taking the same approach, even though the vast majority of the Townshend Acts were repealed because he understood, just like Dickinson did, that, well, once you let them have a foot in the door, eventually it'll become a floodgate. So, of course, we end up with the Tea Act. So resistance to the Townshend Acts over at Wiki, which is actually pretty decent, an overview of some of this historical stuff. A lot of times it's very propaganda-y, but this is actually pretty decent here. Resistance to the tax. They left the tea tax in place, included pressure to avoid legally imported tea, leading to a drop in colonial demand for the East India Company's tea and a burgeoning surplus of the tea in the company's English warehouses. And what was the result? So this was very effective. on saying we don't want this tax. Now, of course, the British didn't get the message that they really should back down, or they're going to really, really back down eventually. They're going to learn by trying to say that they had power over the people in every case, all cases whatsoever, as they did in the Declaratory Act. They would eventually learn that they had power over the colonies in no cases whatsoever. And when government goes too far and the people and the states or the people themselves take the position that government has gone too far and they have the fortitude and perseverance that Samuel Adams pointed out, eventually government will learn that they have no power over the people at all. That's, well, it takes a lot of work. By 1773, the company was close to collapse, due in part to contractual payments to the British government of $400,000 per year. So they got the great idea of, instead of saying, well, this is pushing too far, we're pissing off our customers, basically, if you're thinking about how to raise revenue and stuff like that, we ended up they go with more taxes because government all they think is just hit you with a sledgehammer. We're going to extract more and more and more from you until you can't resist anymore, till you're completely on your knees. And in many situations, that's how it plays out. Once in a while throughout history, you get a different result. And that's really what's needed, again, is that people do not give in. So instead of repealing and saying, well, this is obviously a mistake, we could probably raise more money in a free market situation, allow competition. No. They have to have their mercantilist approach, their highly regulated approach. And then instead they go with the Tea Act, which led to the Tea Party in December of 1773. And the response from the British to that was, again, to push again. And this time in early 1774, with the coercive acts, what a lot of people today incorrectly call the intolerable acts. That wasn't used as a name at the time. And Meharry points out that the series of laws passed by Parliament in early 1774, they were there to punish the colonies, particularly Massachusetts, after the Boston Tea Party. So this is an act of retribution, of punishment. You are out of line and we're going to hammer you until you submit. And that's the approach of government today in almost every situation in my mind, but don't get me ranting on that. These acts included the Boston Port Act, closing Boston Port, the Massachusetts Government Act, stripping virtually all authority from the colonial government, the Administration of Justice Act, stripping authority from local courts, and authorizing basically rendition, taking people out of the country and bringing them to England to stand trial there, where you couldn't have a jury of your peers, certainly. So it authorized trials to be held in Great Britain instead of Massachusetts, and another quartering act allowing troops to take over private buildings. And on May 13th, 1774, a Boston town meeting moderated by Samuel Adams passed a resolution again calling for a boycott of British goods, because you can't stop. You have to keep going. And this led to the drafting of a more formal document, Mike Meharry writes, called the Solemn League and Covenant. This was in June of 1774. It was primarily drafted by the great patriot and war hero, Dr. Joseph Warren. And it declared that the signers, quote, being fully sensible of our indispensable duty to lay hold on every means in our power to preserve and recover the much injured constitution of our country, must take action to prevent a further subversion of our natural and charter rights. So again, talking about a constitution, even though it wasn't written, but you have to actually take a stand to preserve your natural rights, because you don't get them from government, but also the structure of how things are supposed to be in the charter. And Mike points out that rather than the extremes of, quote, the horrors of slavery or the carnage and desolation of a civil war, that's what Joseph Warren was discussing in 1774, a middle ground was pursued. So we will suspend all commercial intercourse with the said island of Great Britain until the said act for blocking up the said harbor be repealed and a full restoration of our charter rights be obtained. So it didn't get super widespread support at that point in 1774, but it did act as a springboard again for the next step. This is all about, as Thomas Jefferson put it to the Reverend Charles Clay in 1790, the ground of liberty is to be gained by inches. You have to be contented to secure what we can get from time to time and eternally press forward for what is yet to get. Because, as Jefferson told us, it takes time to convince men of what is even for their own good. So each step forward, they keep pushing. If you have good people who support liberty and keep pushing, eventually you can win. So that solemn league and covenant did not get widespread report, but it acted like setting the stage, a foundation for the next action, the Suffolk Resolves, which was also drafted by Dr. Joseph Warren. These passed in September of 1774. They called for noncompliance, direct noncompliance to the coercive acts, straight up disobedience to the courts, even tax resistance as well. This is one of my favorite revolutionary strategies that I have discovered and learned about, and I covered it in an episode, Blueprint for Liberty, the Suffolk Resolves of 1774. I should point out, I'm citing a lot of articles and some source documents and things like that. That will all be included in the show notes section. We publish a blog post after every episode over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. Alan Mosley has been doing awesome work doing that. He's starting to do some blogging and things like that as well. But he organizes all the links for each episode and all the other platforms we're on, because we live stream on these mainstream ones, like on X and Facebook and YouTube. We also live stream at rumble.com and odyssey.com. But we archive the video as many places as possible, Minds and Gab, and all over the place, because we want to be available, Brighteon and BitChute. If you're using a platform, we want to be there as much as possible, because our goal is to reach and teach as many people as possible until these people kick us off, because, well, eventually it might happen. We also have the audio-only podcast edition as well. So Alan will get that organized, and I will get it published over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. Taking a look over in the live chat, I want to say a quick hello before I get back to it to everyone here. I really appreciate being here again, whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one. There's Cheriton Farmer, Kirk Morrison, Kirk, the crew chief. There is Howard Clegg, Dixie Strong, Clay Kent, King Nobody, Rick Haji. Did I say Dixie Strong? Appreciate you being here twice. Liberty Freedom. There's Grant, Senator DT, Douglas Fox, Sonny, and a bunch of other people. Thank you guys for being here. I really, really appreciate it. I'm glad you guys find this interesting, because this is pretty kind of niche and geeky stuff. But I love sharing this information. It's so important for the work that I do at the TAC to actually understand what strategy can actually win and how to implement it. And it doesn't matter that the government is so much more armed up today. We have to recognize that the founding generation wanted the people to be really armed up, but only to use this stuff as a very last resort. Because if we're talking about first, hey, this is pointing out why stuff is unconstitutional, and then following up with non-compliance on a state, local, and individual level, just like the founders, the ratifiers told us, James Madison, Roger Sherman, James Iredell, Theophilus Parsons, and so many others. Thomas Jefferson said nullification is the rightful remedy. This isn't about having a war for independence. We're not even anywhere close to that stage, because if we were, people would be on board. We wouldn't be living under the largest government in history, because people would be in love with liberty and not begging for more and more government. We're nowhere close to that. So we have to get the ball rolling and establish that liberty is a positive thing so people can see it play out in practice. Maybe I should do an episode discussing that strategic thought as well sometime. But let me know if you think so. Anyway, so Blueprint for Liberty, the Suffolk Resolves of 1774. This is one of the best ones from 1774. I think was one of the most important years when it comes to strategy. So many people say, we'll have another 1776, but you didn't get there immediately. That was only in response to them. There was so much great strategic stuff that was working and being very effective before that. In 1774, they were really, really hammering it home. Paul Revere took the Suffolk Resolves, and people think Paul Revere just had one ride. He had a bunch of them. This was one of his most important ones as well. He rode to Philadelphia to deliver the Suffolk Resolves to Congress, and on September 17th, they endorsed the Resolves as a show of solidarity with the people of Boston. Remember, this called for disobedience, noncompliance with the coercive acts, directly defying the court system, even tax resistance. And they're saying, the Continental Congress is saying, we endorse this unanimously. This led, Mike Meharry writes, led John Adams to write in his diary, quote, "This was one of the happiest days of my life. In Congress, we had generous, noble sentiments and manly eloquence. This day convinced me that America will support Massachusetts or perish with her. Again, there's no guarantee when you're taking on the empire, when you're taking on criminals with a lot of power and a lot of weaponry, that you're going to be able to win. But if you use smart strategy and you don't go too far too fast, you actually have a chance. In a letter to his wife, Silas Deane, a Connecticut representative said, "I send the resolves of this day, which are applauded to the skies by the inhabitants of this city of Philadelphia." Now, let's go back to Mike Meharry. Now, this laid the groundwork for Continental Congress to pass something as well. They passed a declaration and resolves of the First Continental Congress just a month later. It laid out colonial objections to the coercive acts, pointed out that they were unconstitutional and should be repealed. It listed their grievances. It's a precursor to the Declaration of Independence, and outlined a list of colonial rights, saying, hey, these are our rights. This is what you're not supposed to be doing, and this has to stop. But after asserting colonial rights, Mike says, and, quote, that the following acts of Parliament are infringements and violations of the rights of colonists, and that the repeal of them is essentially necessary in order to restore harmony between Great Britain and the colonies, the Congress declared that the colonies, quote, cannot submit. They had a whole list of stuff that said this stuff is unconstitutional, and if you want to have peace with us, you got to get rid of it. Get rid of it. We will not submit. They say to these grievous acts and measures, Americans cannot submit. Violations of their natural rights means we cannot submit. Today, most people say, they don't directly say it. They may even talk about how they love the right to keep and bear arms and the First Amendment and the Fourth Amendment, whatever it may be, and they're standing up for the Constitution. But really what they do is they say, well, we just got to get this dude in office so he can get the Supreme Court justices to tell us that the government shouldn't have been doing what the government has been doing all along, and then we'll be strong. But this is how it's played out, and this has led to the largest government in history. We have to have an attitude of GFY. Americans, to these grievous acts and measures, Americans cannot submit. So then they took the next step. Just a week later, they passed what's known as the Continental Association. This agreement, Mike Meharry writes, put teeth into the Declaration of Colonial Rights because they're making statements. They're saying we cannot submit, and then they follow up with what they're going to do in response. It represented one of the first formal shows of unity among the colonies, and today it's considered by many historians to be one of the four major founding documents, the Founding Four. The Declaration, first, it's the Continental Association in 1774, the Declaration of Independence in 1776, of course, the Articles of Confederation, which went into effect in 81, and then the Constitution for the United States. These are the founding four. Roger Sherman, my understanding, is probably the only guy who signed all four. So they passed this Continental Association that they said that they were going to implement this strategy against the British. First, it was an immediate ban on importing tea because they were going to be taxed on tea. So now you're going to get no taxes. Either we can do business and someone can make a lot of money and we can be happier, or no one gets anything. Then on December 1st, my birthday, they end importing and consuming all goods, anything and everything from Great Britain, Ireland, and the British West Indies. And then they said, if this doesn't lead to a full repeal of these coercive acts, we're also going to have an export ban. You're not going to get any of our products either, starting in September of 1775. Now, we know it never got to that next step because in the fall of 1774, the British started implementing a pretty aggressive gun control program, which led to the Redcoats marching on Lexington and Concord in April of 1775. I'm already running a little bit long today because there's so much detail, and I find this stuff so interesting as well. So much good stuff to learn from that I covered that in a full episode as well, another 40 minutes or so. It was gun control, what started the war for independence. So they were following this process. No one was getting into a shooting war. It was the British who then came to confiscate weapons, gunpowder. They were implementing this gun control program, and at that point, there was a response. And then in response to that, one more piece that I think is really interesting from John Dickinson and Thomas Jefferson, the Declaration of the Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms, where they explain why they're fighting back. This was unanimously passed in July of 1775. And they put it this way: in our own native land, In defense of the freedom that is our birthright, and which we ever enjoyed till the late violation of it, for the protection of our property, acquired solely by the honest industry of our forefathers and ourselves, against violence actually offered, we have taken up arms. They never actually took up arms and got violent until it was a response. That's how it went down. We shall lay them down when hostilities shall cease on the part of the aggressors, and all danger of their being renewed shall be removed, and not before. There is absolutely nothing that helps us get this kind of history out to more and more people, because we want to learn how to put this type of stuff into practice against the largest government, largest empire. Once again, there's nothing that helps us do this kind of work more than the financial faith and support of our members. You can join us for as little as $2 a month. If you got some of that dirty government fiat that they keep devaluing, please throw it our way over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. We also have lifetime, annual, 5-year options. We have all kinds of different options. You can also, if you don't want to do a membership, some people who are members maybe want to kick in again and throw some support our way. I'm very grateful for any consideration you give. You can also do a one-time donation over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/donate. I'm very grateful for any consideration you can give to joining or supporting us financially today. And while I'm here, I should say a quick but a very huge thank you to just a handful of people who have joined us as members recently. This is just a small number of them, but I'm very grateful for you guys. Michael in New York, great name. April in Texas, Warren in Arizona, Lee also in Texas, and Aubrey in the great state of Tennessee. I really appreciate you guys. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. And since I'm running pretty long here today, I usually try to keep these to a half hour or less, but I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational. I will look through the comments a little bit later on today or tomorrow. I get a lot of great ideas for future episodes. You can also email me, team@10thamendmentcenter.com. Don't forget to leave a review on Apple Podcast or any other podcast platform. Subscribe, smash the like buttons, get notification, all that stuff will help trigger the algorithms of the mainstream platforms and tell them to show us to more people. I'm very grateful for that kind of support as well. Again, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I enjoyed sharing this information with you. And I hope to see you next time here on the path to liberty. Thank you for watching.